Horrifying, unbelievable, overwhelming.
There's no closure for me. I don't think there'll be closure. When you got to carry around the murder of your father, the murder of a loved one, there's never real closure.
I have to forgive her. It's the Christian thing to do. My father would want that. Forget? I'll never forget.
CTV News with Tara Overholt.
Good evening. Elizabeth Wetlocker entered guilty pleas on 14 charges this morning, including 8 counts of first-degree murder. In addition to those 8 charges, she confessed to 4 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Norman James is outside the Woodstock courthouse this evening with more on the day's dramatic and emotional events. Norman.
Tara, Sean Urban was in a Woodstock courtroom this morning where Elizabeth Wetlocker pled guilty to murder times 8. He joins us here now.
Norm, the portrait of a serial killer was laid out here at Woodstock Court. Elizabeth Wetlocker stated she felt God was speaking to her as she killed nursing home patients. Into court walked a woman once seemingly a smiling face of care, revealed today to be a serial killer. Elizabeth Wetlocker stood as she pleaded guilty to murder 8 times over in the deaths of nursing home patients. She also pled guilty to 6 other counts of harming them. One victim, Arpad Horvath, who died at Meadow Park Nursing Home on Southdale Road in London. In a 55-page agreed statement of fact, his daughter heard how her 75-year-old father physically fought off Wetlocker as she tried to inject him with a fatal dose of insulin.
I heard my dad was kicking and fighting. And even when she injected him, he still was okay. So she had to do another one just to kill him.
The story of a killer nurse fatally injecting patients played out over a decade, largely in Woodstock. Repeatedly, the Crown read out Wetlocker's own recollection of her spree of murder. The 49-year-old stated she was increasingly frustrated and depressed with her lot in life and that patients would often annoy her. In multiple cases, she stated she would suddenly get a surging and red-surging feeling, believing God wanted her to select the next one. After the killings, she said she got that feeling, that laughter.
When you look at her, you don't think monster, and that's what she is. She's a monster.
And while she is a monster to many family members of her victims, Elizabeth Wetlocker seemed to have a sense of her own limits. Just prior to her committing herself to an addiction center, she opted not to work at a new job because she'd be required to work with diabetic children. Sadly, she did not hesitate to kill or harm 14 elderly people loved by their families. And Norm, as the guilty plea continues to resonate, already a call for a public inquiry into nursing home care. Tonight, CARC, formerly known as the Canadian Association for Retired Persons, says one is needed to deal with untimely deaths in nursing home environments.
Thank you very much, Sean Urban, reporting tonight. So what will Wetlocker's punishment be? We do know the Crown and the defense have recommended 25 years to life for the murders to be served concurrently, lesser sentences for the other 6 counts. Now, there were 15 victims in this case, all of them residents of long-term care facilities either in Woodstock or in London. The first-degree murder victims, Jim Silcott, Mo Garrett, Gladys Millard, Helen Matheson, Mary Zawinski, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, and Arpad Horvath. The attempted murder victims are Michael Priddles, Wayne Hedges, Sandra Toller, and Beverly Bertram. And the aggravated assault victims, Claudilt Adriano and Albina D. Medeiros. Now outside the courtroom today, raw emotions as family members of the victims tried to process everything they heard today, and for many of them it was all too much. Brian Bicknell has this report.
Family members have heard for the first time the details of how their loved ones were taken, and some of the information is quite disturbing. The reaction is that of anger. Family members of victims file out of the courthouse. They've relived their loved one's death, hearing details recounted in court. An agonizing but necessary experience.
Brutal, overwhelming, and 6 made my stomach sick.
Laura Jackson says 84-year-old Maurice Grenat was more than just a friend. He was a father figure.
And to know that she callously and deliberately took his life. I can't, I'm having a hard time processing.
Andrea Silcox lost her father, James Silcox, who was 84. She was taken aback when in court his final moments and final words were revealed. "I'm sorry," he said.
And then when I heard that my father had final words, it took my breath away, and the grief was just overwhelming. Yeah, it was overwhelming when I.
We buried our loved ones quite a while ago, and we grieved when they passed, and now it's like it happened yesterday.
75-year-old Arpad Horvath was the lone victim at Meadow Park in London. Son Arpad Jr. says this will never be over.
Not even close. There's no closure to this yet. And there's no closure for me. I don't think there'll be closure. When you got to carry around the murder of your father, the murder of a loved one, there's never real closure. There's relief, but never closure.
Some family members blame the system almost as much as they do Wetlaufer herself. Now they're calling for change.
I hope Mr. Dr. Eric Hoskins has 30 seconds on his schedule to do something for the nursing homes, because he's the one who has promised continuously that he will change policies. He will have security, have the nursing homes more watched over.
Family members will get their say in all of this too when victim impact statements are read into the court at a later date. That too expected to be a long ordeal, including everyone from grown children to grandkids expressing how they've been affected by all this. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Brian Bicknell, reporting tonight. So why did a nurse become a serial killer? And how did she finally get caught? CTV's Austin Delaney tonight on what led to Wetlaufer's arrest and today's subsequent guilty pleas.
It was late summer of last year when Elizabeth Wetlaufer was letting people in on a little secret, telling a neighbor she was dealing with an addiction.
About the different stuff she's taking, Percocets, oxys, morphine, you name it.
The nurse's drug problems led to a stay at the Center for Addiction here in Toronto. It wasn't her first treatment there, but it was during her rehab the second time that she divulged another secret. That's when police were called. Late October of 2016, the OPP summoned the media to Woodstock and dropped a bombshell. A serial killer working in area nursing homes had been murdering her elderly patients. The 49-year-old nurse was charged with the first-degree murder of 75-year-old Arpad Horvath, 84-year-old James Silcox, Gladys Millard was 87, 95-year-old Helen Matheson, 96-year-old Mary Salinsky, Helen Young was 90, 79-year-old Maureen Pickering, and 84-year-old Maurice Gannett. All but one of the murders happened here at Care Nursing and Retirement Home in Woodstock. Arpad Horvath was killed at Meadow Park in London, where the nurse had also worked. The investigation into the shocking murders continued, and in January, Wetlaufer was back in court to face 4 new charges of attempted murder and 2 of aggravated assault. The investigation did not let up. Police would then exhume the remains of Arpad Horvath and Helen Matheson. Wetlaufer, a registered nurse since 1995, surrendered her license last September, shortly before police took her into custody, where she has been since the charges were laid.
Austin Delaney reporting tonight. There's so much to consider in this case in terms of why it happened and where this community goes from here. That's going to do it from outside of the Oxford County Courthouse. For now, Tara, I'll send it back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you very much, Norm. Now, with a body count of 8, which could have been higher, Elizabeth Wetlaufer is one of Canada's most prolific serial killers. Joining me now is Dr. Michael Armfield, an expert in this field. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been following this case. You've actually written about it in a new book of yours. Can you give us your first impressions about the confession we heard about today?
Well, I mean, it's a chilling confession. I think that's what everyone thinks. I think the first thing that stands out to me is the number of people in positions of trust and authority, for that matter, who knew about this before we released it and who didn't come forward. And I think that's going to be very closely scrutinized. And it reinforces what I say about all unsolved cases, which is that somebody always knows something. I also think her mindset is, or her alleged mindset is very interesting. And when I say interesting, wildly inconsistent with what we know about a lot of healthcare killers when looking at the 41 in the U.S. to date. But it's going to take some time to unpack all this, for sure.
Obviously, the community, the family members of the victims are just trying to understand this. Can we really ever understand the psyche of someone who does something like this?
Well, we can try, and we've tried to package these people with labels and typologies and motivations and modus operandi, but the reality is that you often have to look into less obvious elements of their life, and I'm particularly interested, as you mentioned in my book, I analyzed Wettlocker's poetry that she was publishing online under a pen name, and that really to everyone I think should offer a window into her mindset, which is that at the end of the day, she enjoyed, unfortunately, doing this. I mean, she talks about the inner laughter. She uses metaphors when describing killing people in her poetry. And I think, again, this is going to be a very important case study moving forward, certainly without precedent in Canada.
And people, obviously, who have family members in home care, they're worried about their loved ones. But is this a unique situation that we've been seeing with a healthcare provider like this?
It is unique. Healthcare killers are very rare, so they weren't even really tabulated until 1970, and we know of 41 in the U.S. since 1970. Healthcare workers do not rank in the top 12 jobs of serial killers. And compare 41 since 1970 to the fact that today the FBI knows that there are at least 400 active serial killing truckers on the interstate. So by way of comparison, and we're not hearing alarm bells go off about that, so by way of comparison, extraordinarily rare, and people need to bear that in mind.
Okay, thank you so much for your thoughts and your expertise tonight, Dr. Michael Ernfield. Well, a legal expert is now speaking out tonight over how rare today's guilty plea is when it comes to first-degree murder. At the same time, the key nursing home at the center of the case continues to work with police to figure out what went wrong. Nick Paparella has more.
This involves anybody who's got an elderly parent, a loved one, somebody in a home that you don't want to hear this happen to somebody else.
Defense lawyer Ari Goldkind says this is a case that resonates with anyone who has an elderly loved one. Wettlocker's plea has saved heartache, time, and money.
She is actually doing something very rare in the criminal justice system, particularly in a case of first-degree murder. She's coming forward and saying, I did it. I don't care whether or not you can prove it. A little detail that people might not know. 2 of the people were exhumed. Their bodies were exhumed in autopsy. The rest were cremated. Think through how difficult that would be. So for her to come forward and to save the massive expense, the massive toll on the families of saying, I didn't do it, Crown attorneys, police officers, prove it, that piece should not be lost. Even though what she did is hideous, she's pleading guilty for it.
The nursing home at the center of the tragedy is speaking out. Through a statement, Crescent Care says, we watch today's developments with great sadness. It goes on, we have been working with law enforcement to support their efforts to establish the facts surrounding the events at our home. Meanwhile, those with current connections to the Crescent Care nursing home are reacting to Wettlocker's confession and guilty pleas.
It's really sad that one person, could come up with something like this. It's really, really sad.
Ed Grills is a resident.
I've been here 6 years myself. Yeah, well, we go going on 7 at that time. No, this is a good place, regardless of